In the early years of World War II, darkness swept across Europe. One by one, nations fell under the grip of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. France was occupied, Poland shattered, the Netherlands and Belgium overrun. By 1940, Nazi Germany had carved out a fortress stretching from Norway to the Mediterranean. To the west, across the English Channel, the United Kingdom stood alone, battered but unbroken. And to the east, the Soviet Union bled in a brutal war of attrition against the German war machine. For years, the Allies had spoken of a second front, a massive amphibious invasion to push the Germans back into the continent and liberate Europe. But it could not be rushed. It would require the largest seaborne invasion in human history. Every detail, every soldier, every drop of fuel, and every bullet would have to be in place. The plan was called Operation Overlord. It would begin with an assault on Normandy, a stretch of coastline in northern France. 5 beaches would be targeted: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each would be attacked by a different Allied force: American, British, and Canadian troops, landing together in a vast and risky gamble. The invasion was planned for the spring of 1944, but the work had begun long before. In southern England, villages turned into barracks. Quiet ports overflowed with ships and equipment. Roads were taken over by tanks, soldiers drilled endlessly. And overhead, the sky filled with aircraft, fighters, bombers, gliders, the sound of thunder preparing for war. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Calm, measured, and respected by his British counterparts, Eisenhower carried the weight of history on his shoulders. His orders would send hundreds of thousands of men into battle. But it wasn't just about strength, it was about secrecy. To succeed, the Allies had to convince the Germans that the invasion would happen somewhere else. They launched a massive deception campaign known as Operation Bodyguard: fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, inflatable aircraft, and most famously, a fictional army group supposedly led by General George Patton, positioned in Kent and aimed at Calais. German reconnaissance planes were fed false clues. British intelligence planted misleading information. Even a corpse dressed as a Royal Marine officer was dropped into the sea near Spain, carrying fake invasion plans. And Hitler believed it. He concentrated much of his defense at Pas de Calais, the shortest point between France and England, leaving Normandy less fortified, but still deadly. Along the French coast, the Germans had constructed what they called the Atlantic Wall, a chain of bunkers, minefields, artillery, and beach obstacles. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been placed in charge of coastal defense. He knew an invasion was coming, but he did not know when or where. As spring arrived in 1944, the Allies waited for the right moment. It would come down to the weather, the tides, and the moon. They needed a full moon for night operations, a low tide to expose German obstacles, and calm seas for the landing craft. The window was narrow, just a few days in June. Originally scheduled for June 5th, the invasion was delayed due to high winds and heavy surf. Soldiers sat in transports and barracks, staring at gray skies, wondering if the order would come. Then on June 5th, a break in the storm. At 4:15 a.m., Eisenhower gave the order. He turned to his staff and said simply, "Okay, let's go." And with that, the great invasion began to move. More than 156,000 Allied troops were preparing to cross the English Channel. They came from America, Britain, Canada, and dozens of other nations. Some were seasoned veterans. Others were young, barely trained. Many had never seen combat. They climbed into landing craft, boarded gliders, fastened parachutes, wrote letters home. The silence before battle is different. It's not quiet, but it feels still. A stillness made of nerves, prayers, fear, and duty. The men talked softly. Some played cards, some slept. Some stared at photos tucked inside helmets. They knew they were about to do something enormous. On the other side of the channel, the French countryside still slept, unaware of what was coming. In bunkers and observation posts, German sentries watched the waves. The sky began to darken. Planes revved their engines. And then, In the final hours of June 5th, just before midnight, the first wave of the invasion began. The paratroopers were on their way. The night was dark. The moon hung low, veiled in drifting clouds casting a faint silver glow across the English Channel. It was just after midnight, June 6, 1944. While most of Europe slept, thousands of Allied aircraft filled the skies, headed toward Normandy. Inside them were the first men to enter German-occupied France. Not by boat, not by tank, but by parachute. These were the airborne troops, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and British soldiers of the 6th Airborne. Their mission was critical. They would land behind enemy lines hours before the seaborne invasion began. Their objective: to secure bridges, destroy key roads, and block German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. The inside of the aircraft was tense. Red lights glowed dimly overhead. Each man sat packed tightly beside the next. They wore heavy packs, ropes, rifles. Some whispered quiet prayers, others sat in silence, lost in thought. The engines roared. The air grew thick. When the green light blinked on, the jump began. One by one, the soldiers leapt into the night sky, parachutes blooming above them like ghostly flowers. But the drop was chaotic. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the skies. Winds scattered the jump zones. Many paratroopers landed miles from their intended targets, some drowned in flooded fields. Others found themselves alone, surrounded by enemy patrols. There was confusion, miscommunication, but there was also determination. Small groups of paratroopers formed wherever they landed. They used hand signals, passwords, and instinct to find each other. They moved through hedgerows and villages, capturing bridges, ambushing convoys, and holding crossroads until help could arrive. One famous site was Pegasus Bridge, seized by British glider troops in a daring silent landing. They held it through the night, fending off counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. Back in the air, many transport planes had returned for more drops. Others circled above, dropping supplies or scouting targets, and below, the beach landings were drawing near. As dawn approached, the invasion fleet emerged from the mist. Over 5,000 ships filled the waters off the Normandy coast. Battleships, destroyers, transport vessels, landing craft. It was the greatest armada the world had ever seen. From the horizon, it must have looked like a floating city, moving slowly toward the shore. On board, soldiers prepared for the assault. They checked their gear, tied letters to packs. Some vomited from the rocking waves. Others stared straight ahead. The first landings would take place at Utah and Omaha, the American sectors. At Utah Beach, the tide had carried some landing craft off course. But by accident or providence, the new location was less heavily defended. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the oldest general in the landing force, personally led troops ashore using a cane and pistol, and famously said, "We'll start the war from right here." Resistance at Utah was lighter than expected. Within hours, troops had pushed inland and linked with airborne forces. But at Omaha Beach, things were very different. The cliffs at Omaha were steep, and the defenses were brutal. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery covered every approach. The landing craft dropped their ramps into a storm of bullets. Soldiers were cut down in the surf. Many drowned under the weight of their gear. Others took cover behind beach obstacles or lay flat in the sand, pinned down by fire. Entire companies were nearly wiped out within minutes. Still, they moved forward. Men crawled inch by inch. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Small units regrouped, climbing the bluffs with ropes, ladders, and sheer will. The chaos was unimaginable. Radio signals were jammed, tanks had sunk offshore. Officers were wounded or killed, but the assault did not stop. By mid-morning, the Americans began breaking through the German lines. One pocket at a time. One trench, one bunker. They turned the tide with grit, coordination, and overwhelming determination. Overhead, Allied bombers pounded German fortifications. Offshore, naval guns fired massive shells, shaking the earth. By afternoon, troops at Omaha had secured the beachhead. It had come at a heavy cost, but they had made it. Back along the coast, the British and Canadians were also fighting. At Gold and Sword beaches, British forces landed with tank support and quickly advanced inland. The town of Bayeux fell the next day, becoming the first French town liberated. At Juno Beach, Canadian soldiers faced fierce resistance. Houses and bunkers had to be cleared room by room, but by nightfall, they too had made progress. All along the Normandy coast, thousands of Allied troops were now ashore. Some had landed exactly where planned. Others were far off course. The casualties were high, but so was the resolve. In just one day, the Allies had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy had been secured. It had not been easy. The day had cost thousands of lives. But the foothold was real. More than 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, scattered across 5 beaches. They had crossed the Channel, stormed the coast, and broken through Hitler's once impenetrable Atlantic Wall. Now came the next challenge, holding the beaches and pushing inland. In the hours after the landings, reinforcements continued to arrive. Supply ships brought ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment. Bulldozers rolled onto the sand. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles. Field hospitals were set up. Temporary roads were built over the dunes. The beaches began to transform from battlegrounds into lifelines. But the Germans were not finished. Though surprised by the location and scale of the landings, German commanders scrambled to organize a counterattack. In the fields beyond the beaches, armored divisions began to mobilize. Some of Germany's most elite units, including the Panzer divisions, were stationed deeper inland. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed that any invasion must be crushed at the shoreline. But Hitler disagreed. The result was confusion and delay. On D-Day, many German tanks were held back, awaiting direct orders from Hitler. And Hitler was asleep. When his staff finally woke him, precious hours had already been lost. That delay helped save the invasion. Still, the fighting inland was brutal. Normandy was not open countryside. It was a dense patchwork of hedgerows, thick earthen walls covered in brush and trees. The terrain was unfamiliar to the Allies and ideal for German defenders. Every field, road, and farmhouse could conceal a sniper or machine gun. Progress was slow and costly. American paratroopers who had landed before dawn were still behind enemy lines. Some were isolated. Others were surrounded, but they held their ground. Many linked up with troops arriving from Utah and Omaha beaches. Together, they secured key roads and bridges. British and Canadian forces pushed from Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. In villages like Caen, the Germans dug in and fought fiercely. Some towns took days to capture. Farms became fortresses. Fields were littered with mines. The sky echoed with artillery and aircraft. But step by step, the Allies advanced. The people of Normandy watched from behind curtains, from cellars, or as they fled. Some waved Allied flags. Others prayed for the safety of their homes. Freedom had come, but not without pain. In towns newly liberated, civilians greeted Allied soldiers with joy, flowers, and tears. After 4 years of German occupation, even shattered cities felt like miracles. Yet the cost was high. Thousands of Allied soldiers had fallen. So had many French civilians, caught in the crossfire or lost to bombings. D-Day brought liberation, but also tragedy. Still, the beaches held. By June 7th, the Allies had linked most of their landing zones into a 50-mile-wide front. Temporary ports were set up to receive endless supplies. Massive floating docks, called mulberries, were towed across the channel and anchored offshore. Within days, hundreds of thousands more troops came ashore. They brought tanks, trucks, medical teams, fuel, and artillery. An entire army was assembling on French soil. But Germany was determined to push them back. Panzer divisions rolled through the countryside. German reinforcements arrived from across France. The fighting grew fiercer. Villages changed hands. Hedgerows became killing grounds. The Allies adapted. American units began fitting tanks with plows to push through hedgerows. British engineers built bridges over craters and rivers. Canadian marksmen climbed into steeples. And everywhere, medics worked around the clock. The battle was not one of sweeping advances. It was a slow, grinding struggle. On June 12th, American troops captured the town of Carenton, linking Utah and Omaha beaches into a single front. British forces pressed south toward Caen. Canadian troops moved deeper inland from Juneau. On June 13th, German tanks launched a fierce counterattack near Villers-Bocage, one of the largest armored battles of the campaign. But the Allies held. Every mile was paid for in blood. But the front line pushed forward. By the end of June, nearly 1 million Allied troops had landed in Normandy. They came from America, Britain, Canada, Poland, France, and other nations. Many spoke different languages, but they fought with one purpose: to break the grip of Nazi tyranny. They were not just liberating land, they were liberating people and building a path to peace. The beaches of Normandy had become the foundation of a greater victory to come. By early July, the Allies had fully secured the Normandy coast, but the fight was far from over. German forces continued to resist fiercely, especially around the key city of Caen. Villages were destroyed, roads were cratered, and fields were soaked with the rain of summer and the blood of battle. For every mile gained, a price was paid. The hedgerow country of Normandy became a battlefield of attrition. Tanks advanced yard by yard. Infantry cleared fields and barns house by house. German snipers and machine guns were hidden in the brush. Artillery pounded advancing troops from the cover of hills. For the soldiers on the ground, it was not a sweeping victory. It was exhausting, relentless. And yet, the Allies kept moving forward. With each passing day, their numbers grew. Supplies poured into the artificial harbors. Airfields were built just behind the lines. Bombers flew deeper into France, and Allied air superiority turned the skies into a constant presence of engines and shadows. In late July, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, a breakout from the Bocage country. Thousands of bombers dropped their payloads on German lines. The earth shook, the sky turned black, and when the smoke cleared, Allied tanks surged through the gap. The breakout began. Town after town fell. German forces retreated in chaos. The once tight defense of Normandy collapsed. The Allies encircled large numbers of German troops at Falaise, cutting off escape routes and capturing or killing tens of thousands. It was the beginning of the end for the German hold on Western Europe. By August, Paris was within reach. On August 25, 1944, the French capital was liberated. Crowds poured into the streets. The French resistance joined with advancing Allied forces. Flags flew from windows. Tears streamed down faces. After 4 years of Nazi rule, Paris was free. The liberation of France had begun with a single day. June 6th, D-Day. The cost had been immense. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed on the first day alone. Thousands more were wounded or missing. Entire units were shattered. The beaches of Normandy are marked today with cemeteries, rows upon rows of white crosses and stars of David, each one a name, a life, a story. But those sacrifices made the impossible possible. D-Day was not the end of World War II. It was not the final battle. But it was the turning point. It proved that Hitler's fortress Europe could be breached. That unity among nations could overcome tyranny. That freedom was worth the risk, the blood, and the storm. It brought together soldiers from dozens of countries. Men who had never met before, who spoke different languages, lived different lives, yet fought for the same purpose. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not as conquerors, but as liberators. The legacy of D-Day echoes far beyond the beaches. It lives in the quiet cemeteries of Normandy, in the museums and memorials, in the waves that still wash over the sands of Omaha and Juneau, and in the silence of families who remember the fathers and brothers who never came home. It lives in the unity of modern Europe, in the alliances that followed, in the long peace that emerged from the ashes of war. It reminds us what courage looks like, what sacrifice feels like, and how history can change in a single day. On June 5th, the world was one way. On June 6th, it began to turn in a different direction. The men who stormed the beaches did not all survive. But those who did carried the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. And now, we carry it too.